The Korean War and Armistice, a look back at the warfare, as well as the truce that still holds after nearly 65 years. The Korean War broke out on June 25, 1950, when North Korean aggression led to the invasion of South Korea. Fighting raged on for 3 years until an armistice was reached, which still holds today as international tensions remain high. The Korean War was caused by many of the short-term effects of the Second World War, but also of events from earlier in the 20th century. For most of the first half of the 20th century, Japan was in control of all of Korea. The article prelude to the Korean War states, Japan was to control Korea's foreign relations, police, military, banking system, and all other vital civil functions. The Koreans strongly opposed the amount of power the Japanese had over them, and as a result, the Japanese increased their level of dominance over the Koreans. The Korean language was prohibited. By the end of World War II, the Koreans were liberated, but they had no political structure, which left them defenseless. The Americans and Soviets divided Korea along the 38th parallel, the boundary between North and South Korea. Also in prelude to the Korean War, it is said that, I quote, both powers were eager to promote friendly governments in the Korea territory under their control. After the two allied powers, the United States and the USSR, took control of a divided Korea, the realization was made that Korea may never again be unified. The Soviets supported Communist Kim Il-sung as a leader for the North, while the United States supported more moderate Syngman Rhee. Both leaders had won after 1948 United Nations elections. Both Koreas were planning possible attacks on the other as the two governments were extremely different. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet premier, assisted in forming the North Korean government, and when Kim Il-sung visited Moscow in early 1949, asking Stalin about the possibility of invading the South, Stalin disagreed, mentioning it would have to be the South that would invade first, mainly because of the fact that the North Korean army was not strong enough. Later, American forces had left the South under the United Nations and President Truman. It also looked as if the South was planning an attack on the North. With growing international support for the North, especially from China, who had just become a communist nation, and less American action, the North was ready to invade the South. North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. Roughly 75,000 soldiers of the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution on June 27th. These sanctions were on the North Korean military. By June 30th, President Truman had ordered that United States forces assist South Korea. Along with the President, the United Nations asked its counterparts to assist the South. Those forces included air, naval, and ground troops. In the article Korean War, it is stated that the United Nations had never used military measures to repel an aggressor. Units from many different nations had been unified under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur. Those nations included combat from Australia, Belgium, Luxembourg, Canada, Colombia, Ethiopia, France, Great Britain, Greece, the Netherlands, New Zealand, the Philippines, South Africa, Thailand, and Turkey, with medical units from Denmark, India, and Sweden. Over the summer of 1950, the war prevailed on as the Communists continued to advance their agenda. The Allies were pushed back at the Pusan perimeter, but rebounded with the landing at Incheon, as well as the capture of Seoul, the South Korean capital, and Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. On October 25, 1950, China entered the Korean War, siding with the North Koreans. The Chinese attacked the Allies just as General MacArthur had become carried away. Just before, as United Nations forces approached the Yalu River, which divided North Korea and Manchuria at the time, China perceived a threat. Due to MacArthur's reckless actions, the Chinese were ready to attack on November 26. In early 1951, Seoul was once again taken over by the aggressors, only to again be recaptured by the Allies. On April 11, 1951, President Truman made the decision to take General MacArthur out of his position.
It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
President Truman added that day, saying, "What we are doing in Korea is this. We are trying to prevent a third world war." MacArthur wanted to bomb areas of China, while President Truman's administration simply wanted to keep the war in Korea, and only in Korea. Throughout much of 1952, deadly fighting continued in mass numbers of casualties. Peace talks had previously begun, only to be ended later and then recommenced. Prior to President Dwight D. Eisenhower's election in 1952, he was very critical of the Truman administration's approach to the Korean conflict because they were unable to bring it to an end. As a candidate, Eisenhower promised to make a trip to Korea in the famous "I shall go to Korea" speech. On November 29, 1952, Eisenhower personally paid a trip to Korea.
The 1952 election of President Eisenhower was the first step to ending the war. On his presidential campaign trail, Eisenhower promised that if elected, he would bring this war to an end. His administration was able to end the war just over 6 months into his term.
On July 27, 1953, the Korean War Armistice Agreement was signed by representatives of the United Nations, the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. The agreement was a truce and immediately ended the bloodshed. The Korean War and the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement had both short and long-term impacts. One of the short-term impacts was the ending of fighting that came as a result of the compromise. Troops from various areas around the world were no longer at battle, and the bloodshed was ended. A total of 2,153,405 casualties came as a result of the war.
The newly created United Nations also played a critical role in galvanizing the negative effects of war. One of its first accomplishments was this document. The Armistice Agreement had a critical impact in world history. The horrific bloodshed of the Korean War was put to a halt with this agreement among the United Nations, Korea, and China. This was a vital turning point.
Another short-term impact was the creation of the Korean Demilitarized Zone and the Military Demarcation Line. This was considered a buffer zone between North and South Korea. Today, the area continues to be strongly defended. Regulations regarding prisoners of war were also discussed in the agreement. It was stated that within 60 days of the agreement being in effect, those prisoners must be returned home, although many prisoners refused to comply. Prisoners of war that were held by the communists were mistreated. Besides the demilitarized zone still being in existence, other long-term effects include the rough relations between the United States and North Korea, as no real peace treaty was ever proposed. With American troops still remaining in South Korea, they have violated the Armistice Agreement. However, to this day, it still remains in effect. The Korean War conflict could have continued for years and years if the compromise, the armistice, was not reached. In this case, the importance of the compromise is shown because it saved a huge amount of lives, as so many had already been lost in just 3 years. Today, the compromise still stays in effect even as tensions rise in Korea. This compromise is very notable for the truce it was, but it also goes to show that a compromise does not always mean a permanent solution.